I'm really pleased to introduce today's presenters, Dr. Emily Fairfax and Alex Funk. Emily is an assistant professor of geography at the University of Minnesota and an affiliate faculty member at the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory. Dr. Fairfax double majored in chemistry and physics as an undergraduate at Carleton College, then went on to earn a PhD in geological sciences with an emphasis on hydrologic sciences from the University of Colorado Boulder. She uses a combination of remote sensing, modeling, and fieldwork to understand how beaver ecosystem engineering can create drought and fire-resistant patches in the landscape under a changing climate. Her research has been featured internationally in National Geographic, the New York Times, the LA Times, PBS, NPR, BBC, Vox, and others. When Dr. Fairfax says she can talk about beavers all day, she's not kidding. Alex is Director of Water Resources and Senior Counsel with the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. At TRCP, Alex leads the organization's freshwater policy portfolio, focusing on advancing federal and state policies to accelerate the deployment of aquatic habitat restoration and conservation efforts. Over the past 2 years, Alex has been working with the Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Forest Service to evaluate opportunities to strengthen the linkage between wildfire risk mitigation and the health of aquatic ecosystems. When not at work, Alex can be found running a trail half marathon or climbing a 14er. We are so excited to have Alex and Emily join us today, and with that, I will turn it over to them.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, really excited to be here today. I'll kind of kick things off and do some table setting, and then we'll turn it over to Emily. And so, just a little bit of background. So we started this project because there's always a lot of interest and attention around wildfire risk. It's a sort of evergreen policy priority, sort of regardless of who is in the White House or who controls Congress. And there will continue to be bipartisan action on wildfire issues and growing interest in new solutions as wildfire continues to have devastating impacts across the country. And unlike other program areas, especially within our federal land management agencies, federal appropriations and funding for wildfire management have actually increased over time. And Congress will, on occasion, pass legislation authorizing supplemental increases in funding, most recently through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act. But a challenge is, this aquatic restoration and conservation efforts that Emily is going to talk about have been historically overlooked as part of that wildfire mitigation toolkit. So therefore, by sort of integrating that aquatic restoration and conservation efforts into broader wildfire efforts, those practices can also benefit from that robust funding, political leadership, and as we'll talk a little bit about near the end of the presentation, some new expedited permitting processes that can allow these projects to sort of accelerate alongside, more well-known fire management practices such as reducing fuels. Next slide, Emily. But the first step in that process is really getting the key agencies, the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management in particular, to recognize that connection. And it's encouraging to see that happening. And so these are just two examples, the one on the right being from the Forest Service website itself, recognizing that, yes, like aquatic restoration management, especially when we think about beaver-influenced landscapes and riverscapes in the West, can provide a wildfire benefit. And so exciting to see that recognition. Next slide. And then similarly with the Bureau of Land Management, and this is more recent, this was the restoration blueprint was a document released by the Bureau of Land Management at the tail end of the last administration, sort of setting out a restoration agenda for the Bureau of Land Management moving forward. But within that blueprint, it does recognize that floodplains can serve as natural fire breaks while providing all these other benefits such as wildlife habitat, downstream flood mitigation and even enhancement of forage and sort of water availability for the landowner community as well. So we're seeing a lot of good recognition from the federal partners around this. The challenge for both agencies is that we need to measure success here. We need measurable outcomes and more evidence that these aquatic approaches can, in fact, reduce burn severity, serve as wildfire breaks, and assist with post-fire recovery, which is why it's been really great to work with Dr. Fairfax because her research is starting to address some of those more measurable, quantifiable elements of this work. And so with that, we'll turn it over to, oh, sorry, one more. We also did, and we can put this in the chat. Emily and I did a recent podcast with the Western Governors Association on some of the research that Emily's about to talk about. And so again, just like we are seeing recognition of that linkage. And now we're kind of getting into that more refinement stage and working to actually kind of get some of these coordinated projects on the ground, which we'll talk about some progress there as well. So Emily, I think it's you now.
I think so. Thanks, Alex. All right. Whoops, too many slides. Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you all about the sort of science, where it's at, where it's going behind beavers and BDAs when it comes to wildfire resilience and mitigation. So beavers and wildfire sometimes feel like there may be a bit of a mismatch. Beaver is a wildlife species. It's relatively small. It's confined to the valley bottoms, whereas wildfire can be an enormous process, megafires being hundreds of thousands of acres. So I understand when people think fire mitigation strategy, maybe beavers are not the first thing that comes to mind. But I want you to take a step back and think about what our rivers look like today. So I'm showing you an aerial image of a section of the Mississippi, not because that's where we're most concerned about fire, but because this is pretty emblematic of what a riverscape looks like. It's constrained to a much more narrow section of the valley bottom. It has development on some sides, it has agriculture on some sides, it has forests, it has public lands, it has private lands, but it's really been sort of leashed in. And that is not necessarily a healthy riverscape. And so when you think about healthy riverscapes, sometimes people say, okay, well, let me think about what a river maybe looked like in the 1600s or 1800s. And these classic drawings might come to mind where the Mississippi is free to explore the valley bottoms, and there's oxbows, and there's bends and meanders and anastomoses and anabranches and all of the river jargon words to say it's a messy river. And while I would agree that this riverscape is drawn here is definitely healthier, many of these drawings and many of our ideals of what makes a river healthy were developed at a time when something was missing. And I am a classically trained river scientist. I'm a river hydrologist, ecohydrologist. My whole discipline really got founded in the late 1800s. We were just for the first time hearing the big names, Strahler, Hack, Horton, Gilbert, Davis, Powell. All these guys were thinking about and developing rules and physics laws for things like stream order and drainage density and stream grading and gradient indexes and all these relationships. And the science just built and built and built as we got into the 1900s. And we're starting to think about floods. We're starting to think about stochastic processes. We're reconstructing paleo floods. The field is truly developing in a huge way scientifically. And before I was a river scientist, I was a physicist. So I really appreciate that all of these different rules and laws were drawn from the most fundamental ways that people were observing the rivers working. But that's the key there. These were developed from people observing how the rivers were working when something was missing. And so if you haven't figured it out, that something is beavers. And beavers have actually been in North America doing their thing, building their dams for a really long time. Not everyone realizes that dam building evolved at least 7.5 million years ago, and it may have been as far back as 25 million years ago. That's an enormous amount of time for beavers to have an impact on the landscape. And it was not all continuous in one place. Ice sheets come and go. Climate has changed a lot over the last 7.5 million years, but beavers have been doing their work for an incredibly long time. They have been doing their engineering for far longer than people have. And they were doing it truly everywhere. What I'm showing you is the river network for the lower 48. And every single blue part of this map is a river or a stream or a brook or a creek. And every single headwater stream, which is about 53% of the streams shown here on this map, would have been full of beavers before the fur trade. They would have been completely engineered by this animal. But they weren't in the 1800s and 1900s because we killed almost all of them. Before the fur trade, there were anywhere between 100 and 400 million beavers in North America. And to put that in perspective, that's about 1 billion beaver dams across this continent. Then, through the fur trade and intentional policies of beaver eradication, their population was crashed down to about 100,000. We were truly that close to losing beavers altogether. Now, I want to emphasize that this happened in the geologic blink of an eye. Beavers had been doing their work. They had been shaping and modifying the landscape for millions and millions of years. And then in about 150 years, they were gone. And all of those dams, 1 billion dams, were basically removed all at once. That leads to continental scale reshaping of our rivers. All of those laws that were developed, all of the things that formed the foundation of my PhD, they were not developed based on the natural state of rivers. They were developed based on the rivers in North America that were in that very moment experiencing some of the most intense and dramatic reshaping and modifications that had ever happened. Today, beavers are bouncing back. We're somewhere between 10 and 30 million beavers today, which is roughly 10% of the historic population. There's definitely room for that to still grow. I don't think we'll ever get back to 100 to 400 million beavers, but every beaver counts and every beaver dam counts. And beavers are really our architects of resilience on the landscape. They did this for a long time. They can do it again going forwards. And we're starting to realize this and think about this a lot more as scientists and as land managers and practitioners. There's guidebooks you can look up, like the Beaver Restoration Guidebook, that was a joint effort by U.S. Fish and Wildlife, NOAA, a few universities, the U.S. Forest Service. All these folks came together to really think about how do we work with beaver to restore streams and wetlands and floodplains? What do beavers need? What kind of conflicts could happen? How do we actually partner with an animal to do geomorphic and hydrologic work? And the kind of work that beavers do, it's really not that complicated. You can see it in the image on the right-hand side of this slide. We've got a classic beaver dammed landscape. This one in particular is from Colorado. There's a deep pool habitat. There's fast running water habitat. There's the dam. There's a lot of different types of vegetation. Most of our streams don't look like that, unfortunately. They look more like the little drawing that starts that sequence: simplified, degraded, disconnected from their floodplains. Beavers move in, they build a dam. That dam starts to slow water down. It is leaky, water's going to go through it, over it, around it, under it, but it does slow it down, and it gives it time to start reconnecting to the floodplain and going back into the soil. The beavers will expand that dam, they'll make it longer and taller and stronger. They want more aquatic habitat. The damming is certainly the most obvious thing that beavers are doing, but it's not necessarily the most impactful. I think one of the more underappreciated aspects of beaver ecosystem engineering are the canals that they dig. So not only do beavers go and build these structures in stream, but they are going to go physically excavate little tiny microstreams that radiate outwards across valley bottoms, across floodplains, moving water, and really increasing their area of influence. The reason beavers do this is because they're awkward. This is an animal that's anywhere from 40 up to 110 pounds, and 110 pounds is the record. Don't expect them to hit 110, but 80 to 90 is not out of the realm of reality for an adult beaver. And when they're on land, they are just extraordinarily awkward. They have a huge paddle tail coming off the rear end. Their back feet are webbed. Their front feet are hands. Their body's like a bowling ball. Evolution has taught them that on land is not the safe place to be. So all of this damming, all of this digging, all of this canal creation and wetland creation is to make more aquatic habitat. That's the key to beavers' safety. They have at least 7.5 million years telling them that if you have water, you will be safe. And so not only are beavers creating wetlands, but they are constantly maintaining wetlands. And it's life or death for them. So there's truly not a more motivated wetland manager out there. And through all this engineering, they're really changing the way that water moves across the river corridor and ultimately downstream. I'm showing you a couple of diagrams here. We've got stream without beavers on the left, stream with beavers on the right. We're looking with depth. So across the top is vegetation. The roots are sticking down into the soil. The stream impact on the groundwater and soil water system, I've made it pretty narrow here, and I've set our water table quite deep. This is common in the American West, as well as on places that have sort of fractured bedrock settings or other reasons that water is going to move quickly downwards away from the surface. The stream with beavers, we have a wider pond area. We have all those little canals they dig functioning like microstreams, kind of pinning groundwater up to the surface. But as long as we have infiltrating precipitation, like rain or snow, it doesn't really matter to the plants where their water's coming from. They're green, they're healthy, they're happy. As soon as we enter a drought, that changes. You cut off that precipitation from above, and suddenly all of your plants are going to rely on water that is stored in the soil. Those undammed streams that are incised and degraded and poorly connected to the floodplain, they do not have a lot of capacity to store water in the soil. The water moves through incredibly quickly. There's very limited surface area for it to actually connect to the physical earth, and downstream it goes. With the beavers, though, because they have the dam that helps slow the water down, because they have the canals that help spread the water out, they've basically filled up valley bottoms with water, and they act like these giant earthen sponges. The plant roots can keep reaching that even if they haven't had precipitation for quite a while. Now, I've studied this in my own research and seen it in Nevada, but my colleagues have seen this happen in other contexts as well, such as the boreal ecosystems of Canada. We can say pretty confidently that beaver wetlands are uniquely capable of resisting drought. And that matters a lot when something starts a fire, because fire is going to burn all of that vegetation that is dry and wilted and withered and sort of shut down, which unfortunately is a lot of vegetation in our river corridors. During the wet periods, because the soil is so fertile and because you have this really nice hydrology of water moving through it, valley bottoms can build up an enormous amount of vegetation and biomass. They can truly become like impassable with thick willows and grasses and reeds and other things. But when that dries out, what was like a booming riparian ecosystem has now become an enormous wick for fire. So unfortunately, our unhealthy riverscapes are not only vulnerable to fire, but they're actively really bad in the context of fire. They can be a wick that moves the fire across the landscape more quickly when they're degraded and don't have their innate fire resilience anymore. Beavers, though, because they're really good at slowing that water down when it's a wetter period and giving it time to sink into the soil so it's available to plants during drier periods, really don't get to that dried out, highly flammable state. And so they don't burn. This is exemplified in the photo on the left. It's also intuitive. If we were out camping and I said, hey, can you go get me a bunch of fire materials? I would like to start a or I don't want to start a wildfire. Sorry, just kidding. I'm not an arson. I would like to start a campfire. You would not go out and you would not come back with this big armful of wet leaves and green branches. Like that's not going to burn. You know that's not going to burn. You don't go fish out the dampest material you can find to start a fire. It's the same thing happening here. The beaver wetlands are just very green. They're very lush. The plants are very wet. They have a high moisture content, and they're not drying out. And so they're just innately difficult to burn. Now, in my research, I've been working on quantifying exactly how hard they are to burn. And I found that overall, we can expect them to be about 3 times more fire resistant than river corridors that do not have beavers working within them. So I want to be clear, this is river to river. This is not river to uplands. Beaver dammed river corridors are more fire resistant than river corridors without beaver. I've also looked at that in the megafire context, which is where these percentages are from. So in a bunch of megafires that I studied, we found that the river sections that had beaver dams, 89% of that area was fire refugia. In the rivers that did not have beaver dams, 60% of that area was fire refugia, which is a lot lower than I would expect in a river that should be wet and a valley bottom that should have a lot of moist vegetation in it. Outside of our river corridor, we're looking at about 37% as fire refugia, so really not very much. That's less than I would expect, especially in some of these forests, but that is the nature of megafires. They burn very hot and very intense, and they can lead to some pretty large swaths of moderate and severe burning. And so seeing all of these things in numeric form is really helpful, but seeing it in the field is sometimes even more helpful to really understand the scale of impact and what beavers are accomplishing. So this particular drone image is from the Mullen Fire, which burned back in 2020. And you can see on the left, the forest is very burnt. The trees here are all dead and the soil is burnt and there is very little life left. And this photo was taken 4 years after the fire. So we're seeing very minimal recovery happening so far in the forest. But you get to the beaver wetland and it's a very different story. So here we have pond after pond after pond after pond. And in this large riparian corridor that the beavers have engineered, you have wetland habitat that's preserved. But if you look closely, there's also upland species preserved. We have adult pine trees, we have adult conifers, we have adult willows, we have adult hardwoods. We have all sorts of vegetation here, not just specifically wetland vegetation. When beavers are able to engineer sort of at their will, at full capacity, like you're looking at here, they're preserving a lot more than just their own personal habitat and their own lodges and their own safety. And in this particular case, we did see some fire breaking. So the fire approached this beaver wetland and a few embers flew over to the other side and burnt off a bit of the trees there. But there's a section that you can see just sort of at the very end of this photo where the fire actually was not able to cross this wetland. And I don't see this super often in large forest fires, but we are starting to see this more often in lower canopy height fires, where the ability to blow an ember to the other side is maybe not as high. We haven't just seen this in the Rocky Mountains and in the West, though. That's a question I get a lot is this just a Colorado thing? Is this just a Wyoming thing? Is this just a California thing? And the answer is no, it's not. We've been looking and we're seeing this in a lot of different contexts. So what I'm showing you here is my preliminary data from a few of the other fires that I've begun looking at. I've started looking up in Alaska, which is facing a lot of challenges with wildfire, especially given how much carbon is stored in Alaskan soils. Preventing that from burning is really important for sort of not feeding into this runaway climate change loop. And lo and behold, in Alaska, we've got a picture on the left, satellite image, where there are beaver ponds along a stream. It's a little bit hard to see, but I've delineated these ponds with little black lines. That's where the dam is. And then on the right is burn severity, where red is high severity and blue is lower unburnt. And again, those little black lines are the positions of beaver dams. And you can see this section of stream, which is all within a beaver's engineered territory here. Their territory is about 1 to 2 kilometers stream length. It was great fire refugia. It was low burning or unburned. It's functioning as we saw them function down in Colorado, down in Wyoming, down in California, and the states where this has sort of been studied and profiled with a little bit more media attention. We've also seen it in British Columbia. We started looking at some beaver ponds up there, same thing. We've got beavers working the valley bottoms and forests that are experiencing very significant fire. Here, I really like to show this particular example because of just how red the landscape was in terms of its burn severity. It was extremely burnt here after the wildfire, except where we had those beavers. And those patches of unburned are almost perfectly correlated with exactly where we have the beavers dam. We have very low burning where the beavers are digging their canals and spreading the water out, but the area of highest beaver influence is also the area of maximum beaver wildfire resistance. And that's very clear to me in our data coming out of British Columbia. We've also tried to start looking in contexts that are quite different. There's a lot of, is it a Western North America thing? Is it a high gradient stream system thing? Is this just a mountain thing? So we've been really searching to try to find all of the possible places and contexts that beavers are existing, that wildfire also exists, to evaluate their fire resistance. And so I'm showing you one of the situations that I think does a good job of that, which is an Ontario fire where we had inactive beaver wetlands. So these particular beaver ponds actually were mostly drained. They did not have active beaver ponding happening. They had been wetlands on and off for a long time. We can see them there going back many decades in the satellite and aerial imagery. But when the fire came through, they were not active. And despite that, they still provided really, really strong fire refugia. And I like this example for a couple reasons. First of all, this is a boggy lowland landscape. I think this is potentially a good sort of insight into what could be happening as we move further north in Canada and we see the permafrost thawing and we get up into Alaska and we see that permafrost thawing. These are the kinds of landscapes that happen. You get these big peatlands in your tundras. And here, the beavers, through their natural cycles of abandonment and recolonization of their dams, have created really fire-resistant river corridors and that resistance persists even in the absence of the beaver. And that's really key. I am all about relying on beavers, but I'm also all about acknowledging that a beaver is an animal that makes choices, and we don't fully understand what their agenda is or what they do when and why. So as we're expanding this, and we're looking at more and more fires, we are also starting to parse out in what situations are we finding fire refugia. So I've just showed you on this slide a screenshot of one of the tables of data that we're working on. You can see our fire names, the alias that we're using for it in our analysis, the year it burned, where it burned, its size, how many dams we've mapped in it so far. Dam mapping is time consuming, even with our tools like Eager. This is taking a lot of time to validate all of these dam positions and lengths. But we're working on it. And as we do, we're double checking. Are there examples of beavers within this fire? If yes, let's add it to our list. And this will be a place that we study. And in all of these fires so far, we have observed fire refugia. So the beaver wetlands are not burning. A subset of these when we have started looking at them in more detail, we're realizing that the edges of the fire are contained in part by beaver wetlands. And often these are wetlands that are very well developed, very tightly packed. And these fires do not tend to be enormous, super high crowning wildfires that are blown by incredible winds. They're a little bit more moderate intensity. So for the fire refugia studies, we're pretty much following the same methods we have before, where we go in and we evaluate the burn severity beforehand, we evaluate the burn severity by looking at the greenness signatures before the fire and then after the fire, and then use the positions of beaver dams to determine if their influence was significant or not on burn severity. We're doing the same thing in our fire breaking situations, except we're also drawing out the fire spread contours. And so we're looking day by day as best we can using super high resolution satellite imagery and tools like PlanetScope and Sentinel and Landsat, really trying to leverage every image we have to put together the story of how these fires spread and to see what happened when they approached the beaver wetlands. Did they truly stop? Did they stall? Were they stopping everywhere? Was something else the reason why they were stopping spread on those days? My gut says no. Having looked at some of these, they're really tightly controlled by the positions of large beaver wetlands. But this is research that's ongoing, and we hope to have these results put together sometime over this summer. Now you might be thinking, okay, beavers seem great, and they're doing a lot of work. What if we don't have them? What if we can't have them? Or what if we want them, but they're not here yet? And the answer to all of those questions is beaver mimicry structures or beaver dam analogs or other types of low-tech process-based restoration that can kind of kick off this process that beavers do and ideally create the habitat that brings beavers back. Just like with beaver restoration, we also have a guidebook for low-tech process-based restoration where you can go and flip through and learn how to look at the landscape that you're working in, how to think about what the river wants, what it's missing, what it needs to return to a more resilient state. Oftentimes what that means is you go out and you be the beaver and you try to build a beaver dam. And I will say, people are kind of bad at this. So we build lots of different kinds of BDAs. The one shown here is what's called a posted BDA. So you drive posts into the stream bank, and then you try to build your structure on top of that. People also build postless BDAs where they don't have that. Postless work in lower gradient systems or places where you don't have super flashy hydrology. When we do have really flashy hydrology, we have not had 7.5 million years of engineering experience. So we need posts to help us keep those structures in place a little bit longer. I want to emphasize, though, that the point of a beaver mimicry structure or a BDA or LTPBR in beaver restoration context is to bring back beavers. It cannot do all the work for you. It is not the same as beavers. Remember how I was saying there's no better maintenance staff to have than the beaver. Like it's life or death for them to keep that wetland wet and to keep the water in the soil and to keep it in the pond and to keep it in the canals. They don't want it to dry out. They can't let it get flammable. That would be the end of it for them. That's really important, it turns out. And when we just put in BDAs, we can get some of the work that beavers do. We can increase a little bit of erosion and aggradation and start to re-meander the stream a little. We can get some pooling. We can get some complexity. We can get some floodplain storage. That is all 100% true. If no one is out there maintaining those BDAs, they will stop functioning like beaver dams in a few years. And that might be fine. Maybe that's the goal of the restoration project. But if you're shooting for wide scale fire resistance and resilience, you probably want to have the engineers on site. And luckily, BDAs are designed to be something that can create really good beaver habitat. So we highly recommend building these things, kick off the restoration, improve the habitat just enough that your maintenance engineers show up, and then they take it over from there. Sometimes they're brood. Sometimes they will pull apart your BDA. Sometimes they will harvest the materials and use it somewhere else. Sometimes they will ignore it and build 6 inches downstream. I've seen both of these situations, but sometimes they'll build right on top of it. Sometimes they will literally take over your structure and improve it. And then they go do their other engineering behaviors. They cut trees. This is a common point of conflict with beavers. People don't want them to cut trees so much. We really like our trees. But that tree cutting is important. It's important for the beaver. It's also important for fire resilience. That's their type of fuel thinning. They also are going to go out and dig those canals. They are going to cause localized flooding, another point of conflict, but another source of major amounts of fire resilience. And so we can either have our engineers out there chewing on trees and digging canals. It's possible. I don't think I've seen any beaver mimicry projects that go that far. Or we can design these and build these in a way that does encourage beavers to return. And when beavers do show up, we make sure that they are able to stay there. We manage these conflicts so that people do not immediately want those beavers gone. So I want to show you just a little bit of the preliminary data I have on the wildfire resilience that we see around beaver dam analogs. This is a question I've gotten quite a bit over the last few years is, okay, we have a lot showing that beavers are really good at creating fireproof patches. And that feels like people are finally over the hump on accepting it, even though beavers are just like a giant water rat. Maybe they really can do landscape scale work. But are these BDAs worth it? Are they doing the same thing for us? Are they doing any fire resistance work for us? They are for sure being installed to create fire resistance. That is a project type that is actively happening in a lot of places. So what does the data say so far? Is that achieving its goals? The first example I'll show you is from the Dixie fire. So this burned in California. It was about a 1 million acre fire. And this is an example of BDAs being installed in a mountain meadow context. So this is not necessarily a riverine context. This is big mountain meadows that have had a lot of degradation for a lot of different reasons. And in the Dixie fire, beaver dam analog installation was one way that people were trying to fix this degradation. So a lot of beaver dam analogs had been installed in a meadow called Tasman-Coyum. And this was a collaboration between the Mountain Meadow Summit Consortium and Swiftwater Design and others, where they had been going out and just building BDA after BDA after BDA. The end goal here was to bring back beaver. Beaver are a culturally important species for the Meadow, and they wanted to make the habitat acceptable to bring beavers back. So they were out doing all these BDA installs, and then the Dixie fire came through, which provided a really good natural study of what happens in a mountain meadow that has been modified with these structures when a large and intense megafire occurs alongside it. So to answer that, we went through our fire perimeter and we found examples of beavers that were working in meadows. So we're keeping the context to meadows, not rivers. We found meadows that had beaver engineering in them. We found meadows that were unrestored and that were just up there doing what they were doing. We took a bunch of data from the hill slopes and the uplands where we're expecting to see the worst fire severity because it is not a wet part of the landscape, especially where Dixie burned. And then we also looked at where the BDAs had been installed. And what we want to really answer here is, how do the BDAs function relative to these three other landscape types? We expect the beavers to make really fire resistant habitat. They've done that before. That's not the point of the study. That's sort of what we're expecting is like maximum fire resistance control point. We expect the hill slopes to burn pretty badly. We've been inside the Dixie fire perimeter. It was bad in a lot of places, and it was really bad around Tasman-Coyum and other mountain meadows. We're not exactly sure what to expect from the meadows that haven't had restoration within them. Some of the meadows are healthier than others. We tried to make sure we had enough samples that we were not biasing towards like otherwise relatively healthy or unhealthy meadow ecosystems. Are the BDAs, the meadows that have been messed with by us putting in fake beaver dams, are they going to act more like a beaver site or a site that has had nobody working in it at all? And so these are our burn severity distributions for the beaver dammed areas, the mountain meadows, and the hill slopes. Blue is unburned, red is high severity. As expected, the beaver dammed area is almost exclusively unburned, a little bit in the low severity, and I think we've got like maybe 2 pixels in moderate. The mountain meadow has a lot of unburned, a little bit more in the low severity, some in the moderate, and it does tail off into high severity in a noticeable way. And then our hill slopes, we just had a lot of burning that happened. There were some unburned areas. There was fire refugia outside of our mountain meadow contexts, but there was also quite a bit of moderate and high severity burning. When we looked at where the beaver dam analogs have been built, our distribution had a lot of unburned in it, and this was encouraging. However, we also had more of a tail going off into moderate and high severity than we did in just the beaver dammed areas. Comparing them all together, we can say pretty confidently that our BDA sites did have the lowest average burn severity, as they were unburned on average. It was marginally lower even than our beaver sites, but those were also unburned on average, so we don't consider that to be a meaningful difference. They were more variable, though, and I should say both the BDAs and the beavers were significantly lower than the meadows or the hill slopes. The BDAs were a lot more variable. In their burn response, we did see some parts go up into the high severity category that was not witnessed by the beavers, but we are achieving fire resilience with them in the meadow context. What I think was more interesting, though, than the immediate fire response was the post-fire response in the BDA meadow. So before the fire, we have our BDAs in green, our beavers in blue, and the meadows in yellow. I'm showing you NDVI, or plant greenness, on our y-axis. And that first cluster is before the fire. They're all looking pretty green. The beaver areas are the greenest because they're super drought resistant. Again, this is not unexpected. We go into the fire times. As the fire is burning through, we see our greenness drop in both our meadows and our BDA areas. We get a small drop where the beavers are working. This is also not completely unexpected. We expect the beavers to have the strongest fire resistance. But then curiously, after the fire, the beavers are still super green. Again, not surprising. The BDA area bounced back much more strongly than our meadows that did not have beaver dam analogs within them. And when we look at the slope of those lines of recovery, it's about twice as much recovery that happened in the BDA meadows compared to the meadows that did not have structures within them. We're trying to think about why this might be a little bit more. We have some theories and we have some observations that at least partially support our theories that a lot of this is coming from the way that the BDAs are able to deal with the post-flood debris, or sorry, the post-fire floods and debris flows. So after fire, when the hill slopes are super burnt that way, all of it's going to come cruising down into the meadows the very first rainfall. And in California, where these fires were, shortly after all of them burned, began the nonstop series of atmospheric rivers. So a lot of material is washing in. When you don't have structures in place, you kind of get into this cycle of the stream excavating itself and digging itself deeper and more disconnected and more degraded and more incised. But when you have those BDAs in place, they can catch that sediment, and instead of letting the force of this flooding further destroy the meadow, what it does instead is sort of accelerates a form of stage 0 restoration, where you're resetting it all back up to the top and letting the streams meander across that surface again. So that was the meadow context, which is interesting. I think we're seeing the strongest post-fire impact there. I'm also going to show you a little bit of data from the Ridge Fire, which burned just this past summer in California. And this is a river or a stream context. So here's a true color image of the Ridge Fire. And I've drawn a little white box around the only place within this fire perimeter that had beaver dam analogs installed. And there are no beavers within this fire perimeter, to be clear. And you can kind of see, if you really squint and you have your brightness turned up all the way, a little bit of greenery in that box. True color is not the best thing for visualizing fire effects on the landscape. I prefer to look in other bands of light or indices that can really highlight contrasts better, such as our moisture index, where blue would indicate we have a lot of moisture and red would indicate we have very little moisture. You can still sort of see the shadow of this fire perimeter footprint. And within that box where the BDAs are, you can see quite a strong moisture signature. Or you can look in false color, which is good for visualizing burning. Here, black would indicate burnt areas and red would indicate unburnt areas. Again, right within that box, we're seeing a nice little flash of red. Or maybe look in the shortwave infrared, which is very sensitive to vegetation. And we expect green to indicate living and healthy vegetation and red to indicate burnt and non-existent vegetation. And again, there's that bright green spot right there. And if you are not able to see it super well in the zoomed out version, it's extremely clear, actually, even in true color when we zoom in. In true color, in a satellite in space, looking down on this fire, we can see that greenery and we can see that moisture. We can see the vegetation alive. We can see it thriving and doing its photosynthesis. And going into this area and looking specifically, there was just one tributary of the Sulphur Creek that had been restored with BDAs. And when that fire came through, that was one of our only patches of fire refugia within this entire perimeter that was continuous aquatic and semi-aquatic habitat. I wanted to compare that area where the beaver dam analogs have been built to an otherwise incredibly similar drainage that did not have any beaver-based restoration within it. So unrestored, no BDAs, nothing. And I wanted to see if there was a way for us to predict before that fire happened that it was going to be fire refugia. So I started looking at a time series of NDVI, the plant greenness. We've got our control stream, that one with no beaver dam analogs or beavers, in gold, our beaver dam analog stream in blue. Now we expect NDVI to have a seasonal arc. It's going to peak every summer. It should be pretty round, and then it'll drop off in the fall and into the winter when they don't have as much sun. When we're water stressed, we see more of a shark fin shape or a pointy shape, and that indicates that it's just shutting down earlier than you would expect because it's water stressed. Now, both the BDA and the control stream do have this sort of shark wave shape in 2020 and in 2021. The BDA stream was already slightly greener than our control stream, but they both are experiencing water stress the same way, as evidenced by the shape of these curves. Going into 2022, we had a little bit of a wetter year at this site, and so we were able to get a little bit more of our rounded seasonal arcs and greenness. Here, we actually saw the control stream reach a more green state than our BDA stream, the future BDA stream. And then what we're really looking for is to see, is it able to stay above the 0.3 threshold? 0.3 on NDVI is the minimum value I expect for a healthy riparian zone during the growing season. So during the summertime, it should be consistently above that. Once the BDAs were constructed, there was a fundamental difference in the shape of our greenness curve. It still went up really high in spring. It started to drop off, but then it sort of takes a while coming back down. It's almost like we've puffed up or inflated this greenness curve, and it stays green much, much longer into the growing season. In fact, there are about 4 months where the BDA stream was green and the control stream was not. Then the ridge fire burned, and our BDA stream did not really look any different in terms of its greenness signature than it did the year prior. Whereas our control stream, it immediately dropped down below that 0.3 threshold. It burned heavily, and it did not recover for the rest of that year. So looking at these kind of data, I now feel like I can say with relative confidence, beaver dam analogs can function as a way to create fire refugia. And if we can look at their history of greenness and how it's changed after installation, we may even have insights as to when we have achieved a state that will be fire resistant in the future. When we have this elevated greenness, when we have this resistance to water stress, what we've learned from beavers is that that's when you know you're going to be fire resistant too. I wish I had more examples to show you, or like really nice synthesis of information with a lot of percentages and p-values. But the truth of it is these have all been really opportunistic field sites, and we're working on modeling in the meantime, but we really do need more field sites. So this is my brief call for help. If you have beaver dam analogs and you know that they've experienced a fire, please share those locations with us so that we can include them in our study and really try to fine tune where does this work and where does this not work. And with that, I'll pass it back to Alex.
Thanks, Emily. And I know there's some great questions in the chat, so I'm just going to briefly kind of cover some of the policy implications or sort of work that we've been doing as a result of Dr. Fairfax's work. And I'll just start by talking a little bit about the Wildfire Commission. If you aren't familiar with this, this was a group that was pulled together to put together a report for Congress touching on nearly every facet of the wildfire system. And this report was finalized, I think a little over 2 years ago, but it includes 167 on consensus recommendations for Congress to better mitigate and manage wildfire. So it provides really important roadmap for how the federal government is approaching this issue moving forward. And I did just want to highlight there are other recommendations that touch on this, but recommendation 35 really speaks to what Emily has been talking about, and that is sort of putting more resources behind filling some of those data gaps as it relates to the benefits, wildfire risk reduction benefits of process-based restoration approaches, which does include, as a subset, beaver dam analogs and some of those other approaches that Emily was talking about. So it was really good to see that recognition, and we would, of course, love to work with the fire science networks and folks that are involved with the Joint Fire Science Program to continue to work to fill those data gaps. Next slide. Also, really exciting news. This is all just as of last week. So there's currently a very significant piece of wildfire legislation under consideration in Congress. This is the Fix Our Forest Act. It passed the House with bipartisan support earlier this year. The Senate version was just introduced last week. And I wanted to highlight this section because for the first time in federal statute, there is now a recognition of the linkage between wildfire risk reduction and aquatic restoration efforts. Something that we feel like we've been kind of missing as a hook in some of a top-down direction to wildfire management agencies, that these approaches do in fact have those wildfire resistance benefits. And so And I'm happy to answer more questions about how fixed our forests work, but I'll just note that fireshed management projects and the definitions thereof are really important to the overall structure of the bill, which essentially directs the Fire Service and BLM to work with states and tribes to map out these fireshed areas and then to set up sort of assessments and implementation strategies to implement these fireshed management projects, which now do include wet meadow, floodplain, and repairing and restoration activities. So really excited to see that. A lot of work to be done to like help inform implementation of this, but it was really exciting to see that last week. Next slide. And then on the more the administrative side, I mean, I think what we're really focusing now on in this space is trying to link this aquatic restoration work with the current administration's priorities, and in particular, around wildfire risk management, but also boosting timber harvest production, in general, efforts to address issues around like tree salvage and insects and disease and things like that. And I'll just highlight one example where we're seeing some interlinkages here, and that's this Lost Meadows effort that's spearheaded by Dr. Karen Pope out of the Pacific Research or Pacific Southwest Research Station at the Forest Service, which essentially is that project is using machine learning to map where there are historic wet meadow complexes in the Sierra Nevada that have now been due to that the beaver loss and other changes to the landscape have shifted to more those dry kind of like conifer-based systems, but they've basically been able to map where those footprints are, and there's an effort underway to restore them. And so as you can see, there's kind of hopefully some linkages between that process and what this administration is looking at, but certainly something we could use some help with on building those connections further. Next slide. So bringing this all together, and then we can kind of love to answer some questions. But so overall, we are seeing that strong interest and recognition in the policy space on this, but we do need further socialization of those measurable results, and especially how those link to a new administration's priorities around timber reduction, wildfire risk reduction, and that is timely and critical. And as a result, we definitely need more. To build on Emily's request for more data sites, we need to see more joint planning. This is something that's really big right now, topic of within the Forest Service aquatics team, is that we need to be locating where we can do upland and aquatic restoration work as part of this sort of integrated resource model is the concept. And there's examples out of Oregon, the Camp Creek effort, that are sort of like the standard right now, but they're sort of isolated and ad hoc, and this is still something that's not kind of the default when we're planning restoration work on the ground. So that's something that we can kind of continue to highlight a greater need for and more examples for. And so we're not just seeing one fire solution sort of like take heed, but we're having a more holistic approach. And then we're working on continuing to cultivate that diverse support. So we have been talking a lot with state and tribal forest, natural resource, wildfire management agencies around these linkages. We're talking to the ag and landowner community around sort of the benefits of the BDAs, especially in the context of like rangeland health and grazing permittees. They play a really important role in making some of these projects work. And then certainly the timber industry partners. So where can we align those sort of like timber harvest targets and production with, potentially wet meadow restoration and other aquatic restoration opportunities, and even using the outputs of that harvest as, source material for construction of BDAs and other materials as well. And so happy to talk more about that. But, thanks again for the time, and happy to answer any questions we have in the chat.
Alrighty, fantastic. Thank you so much, both of you, for a really informative presentation. I'm sure that there's a lot that we didn't get to, and hopefully some of these questions can get to those unanswered topics. But otherwise, folks can always follow up with Alex and Emily. Their contact information is in the chat, and it'll be shared out afterward. All right, so we'll go ahead and start out with a question about communications. What are some of the more successful methods to change the public and rancher view of beaver from pest to benefit?
I think in my personal experience, the best way to really change someone's mind is to take them to a healthy and well-developed beaver wetland. There's a lot of sort of myths and worries about them being like stinky or ugly or gross or messy or all these other words that people just kind of associate with wetlands. But when you visit them and you see them, like there's wildflowers, there's butterflies, mint grows across the beaver dams, and it actually smells nice when you walk on it. And people like need to viscerally experience that because it's not the same as me just saying beaver wetlands are good. I also say that quite a bit, and I feel like if I say it enough, it'll start to stick. But I can't overstate how important physically going to the field is. And I don't know, Alex, if you want to add anything to that.
It's just telling those success stories. I mean, again, we are seeing, evidence of, where you work with the landowner community around sort of the strategic installation of some of these restoration practices and coexistence measures. Irrigators are seeing, like, for example, enhanced water availability, longer growing season opportunities and irrigation water availability. Like, these projects don't create water, but they can retime it in a way where water is available in that crucial summer, early fall growing season. And so again, just getting the word out that, yeah, there are success stories and kind of getting the ranching community more engaged, which we are doing to a big extent on some of the restoration efforts.
All right, so this next question kind of tears off of what you were just talking about with water availability. Just wondering, can beaver or BDA damming lead to increased fuel loads that are then available to burn and could promote larger and more intense fires? Or does the water retention that you've been talking about mitigate that possible consequence?
That's a great question. I will say that in almost every example I've looked at, if the beavers are still there or if they're in their natural regime of being there and then being gone, we see the fire resistance strongly persist in the vegetation that they're working. So you don't get this like big grow up around the beavers and then it burns. As soon as we have the dry period, in my study, they withstood drought for 3 years and then the drought ended. So maybe it could have been longer. I will say I did see one example of exactly what's being discussed, which is where you see all of that vegetation that grew up become a risk. And that was a particular stream in California where the landowners removed every single beaver dam right before the fire came the year before. And then it all was in the process of drying out and they didn't thin out any of the vegetation. They just took away all the water. They killed the beavers. That section burned. And immediately upstream, where the beavers were not removed and where their dams were intact, was really strong fire refugia. And I think that speaks to the difference between natural beaver colonization and abandonment versus full-scale removal by people, which geologically and geomorphically, this is like simulating a 100-year flood or even larger flood. Beaver dams can withstand really strong disturbances. They don't naturally just all fall apart all at once. And so I'm not entirely surprised that situation burned. Hopefully people just don't remove entire reaches worth of beaver dams if they want to have fire resistant rivers.
Alrighty, so kind of tearing off of this question again. Just wondering, how do you attract beavers to an area and get them to start damming? So there are a couple of particular questions in here. One, are BDA areas more likely to attract beavers? And then once the beavers get there, why do they sometimes only create bank dens instead of actually damming across the river?
My joke answer is you just have to build a culvert and then beavers will show up because they love to plug culverts. But my real answer is that doing riverscape restoration, whether through beaver dam analogs or other low-tech methods, does improve the quality of beaver habitat and make it more likely for them to come. In places where they're really food limited, maybe the restoration involves planting some of their favorite food species, so like willows and aspens and cottonwoods and all of those sort of riparian forest plants. Sometimes they're only denning banks because they can't get their dams to stick. If the stream is really incised, it can be incredibly hard for them to overcome that. A great example of this being remediated is Bridge Creek in Oregon, where the beaver dams were blowing out every single year because of really degraded hydrology. People went in, built beaver dam analogs, but also actually put posts into the beaver dams to just give them a little bit of a fighting chance. that restoration started. And once the beavers had a little more control over the hydrology, the posts were no longer needed. And the beavers were out building their own dams again that were withstanding the floods without having that extra support. So there is a point, I think, where streams are in such rough shape, they really need us and beavers together. And I would guess that that is one of the reasons they might not be building. The other reason is if it's like a lake or a really big river, it's already deep enough and they don't need to dam.
Okay, thank you so much, Emily. So we're going to pivot just a little bit. There were some questions about GIS and mapping. Some folks wondering, is there spatial data available for the location of beavers? And then just about how you got some of your other data. How did you measure the degree of burning or wildfire resilience? Did you use satellite? So where does your data come from?
There's not like a nationwide data set of where beavers are and aren't. I would love to make one. It's a huge effort. We do mapping projects all the time and partner with people. So if you are interested in having your area mapped either by hand or with machine learning, definitely reach out and we can talk about what that might look like. In terms of the burn severity data, we use a combination of satellite sources where we calculate differential normalized burn ratio and also changes in NDVI, usually using Sentinel-2 because its pixel size is 10 by 10, which is a little bit better than Landsat, but we'll use Landsat if we need to go further back in time. We use scripts to do it ourselves, but you can also get data from like the Monitoring Trends and Burn Severity database. We do go to the field as well to try to get observations to make sure what we're calculating as a high burn severity pixel actually correlates to high burn severity on the ground. So we'll look to see how burnt are the trees, is the soil burnt, is there recovery or not? So mostly remote sensing, a splash of field work.
All right, awesome, thank you. And I know that we are right at the top of the hour. We have a few more questions to get through. So if folks are able to stay online, we'll go just a couple of minutes over to answer some of those questions. Okay, perfect. Okay, what impact does a post-fire environment, so erosion and sedimentation into wetlands, excess nitrogen or other chemicals, etc., have on beaver populations?
It's an awesome question. Ellen Wool's group out of Colorado State and Sarah Rathburn's group have been doing a lot of research on the beaver wetlands and meadows that were in the Cameron Peak fire. And some of the data that they found, some of the results that they found is that these meadows, whether the beaver dam is active or not, are incredibly powerful at retaining sediment and ash and debris and keeping it up in the headwaters and using it for geomorphic restoration purposes, basically, rather than letting it all go downstream and plug up downstream water supply. In terms of the chemical changes that happen post-fire, there's not a lot of data on this for beavers specifically. It's a great plug for my summer fieldwork, which is going to be in Wyoming mostly, where we are bringing a water quality person with us for the first time. And we're hoping to start looking at how beavers have affected downstream water quality, at least at a very surface level way post-fire. We see the ash retained, we see the sediment retained, but fire is a massive disturbance, and really trying to pull apart all of the biogeochemical processes is more than I can say from remote sensing.
Okay, so we'll be on the look for more research in the future. All right, this next question is kind of about how you balance different pressures on the environment. So how do you balance beaver restoration with management of ungulate populations that eat all of the willow or other riparian vegetation that beavers depend on? And then the second part of this question is, how do you balance beavers being present versus them killing new saplings that have just been planted in a BDA area? So pressures from both sides.
Great question. The big grazers are a real challenge. Elk and moose, especially in the Rockies, can really destabilize rivers. They are lacking a lot of their predators, and climate change is increasing their range downslope. So that's a tough one. Fencing can help. Reducing populations can help a lot. I can say with pretty high confidence that here in Minnesota, where we have healthy wolf populations, we don't see the deer outcompeting the beaver. So there is something to be said for having a holistically balanced ecosystem, especially when it comes to river health. Yellowstone's also a really good example of that. In terms of beavers eating Saplings, they really don't prefer saplings. It's not good flavor to them. It's not as nutritionally helpful to them. They would prefer to have a mature tree or a tree that is a young adult tree. If they're mowing down the saplings, they probably don't have enough access to other foods. And so if this is part of a restoration project and you need those saplings to establish, I often recommend fencing them for the first year or two and keep your BDAs, but maybe delay the beavers' arrival for a year or two so you can kick that off and get it started. The beavers are going to be hungry. They're going to chew. If that's the only thing available, it's going to be the saplings. Most of the tree species that beavers really like to eat have natural defense. They'll put out new shoots as soon as they're clipped. They will regrow from cuttings. That's why we have willows that grow along the crests of beaver dams. So once you get out of this sort of initial like overstressed disturbance phase, the vegetation and beaver pressure self-lessens. It's a negative feedback loop in that way.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for that really thorough answer. Okay, so I know we're a few minutes over. This will be the last question for today. Have you looked at other aspects of how BDA streams may differ from control or beaver dam streams, such as soil moisture content, vegetation species, and slope and aspect, to account for differences in weather or location and show that beaver activity truly reduces or changes fire impacts?
A great question. I've done that for beavers. I've got like 4 BDA sites, so I have not been able to as thoroughly dig into this for BDAs yet. This example I showed from Sulphur Creek, just as like a case study, I had 2 streams opposite side of the drainage. Those are the data I showed. I've also looked at all of the other streams going into Sulphur Creek and found similar responses. That one fits on a slide the most nicely. So in that sense, yes, I am exploring the full fire scar every time. I'm not just selecting one Beavers or BDA site and then one corollary. I'm comparing all of the different drainages and trying to parse them out by what is their geomorphic context, what's their hydrologic context. I don't always have soil moisture information except what I can get from satellite, so I try to use that. This is my push for everyone to do a little bit of monitoring before you throw in a BDA if you can, because that data is so helpful. It's a lot easier to do a true before after study than to have to use this sort of space for time approach and find other drainages that are otherwise super similar but don't have the treatment of the BDA.
All right, we'll go ahead and leave it there. Dr. Fairfax and Alex, thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks to everyone for being online, and I'm looking forward to seeing where this research goes in the future. Seems like there's still a lot of room to continue working on it. So thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you on the next one. Take care.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.